Well, this is not for the faint of heart. So have you ever been in a situation where, having learned how to operate a digital mode, you've given it a try and were frustrated in getting it to work a second time?
No, never happened.
That's happened to me more often than I can count. It wasn't maybe a year or two after I was first licensed that my neighbor introduced me to digital modes. This was about 10 years ago. And I thought it was pretty neat, but the next time I went back to the digital modes, I was a bit flummoxed because it wasn't working in quite the same way. So if that's ever happened to you, then this presentation is for you. Because I'm trying to summarize some experiences that I've had that led me down a path to make it a little easier for me. Now, in my case, I was so frustrated with troubleshooting digital modes that I kind of gave up on it for a little bit. And it's my hope that giving you some ideas to take the, I'm going to call it agita, a fun word, acid indigestion, general malaise, to take that out of the digital troubleshooting experience. So on the screen right now, wave your hand at me if you kind of recognize what's on the screen. Okay, most everybody is raising their hand, but not everybody. So on the screen right now, I've got on the left-hand side is the WSJTX incidence. It's the application that uses the Joe Taylor created mode FT8. And on the left-hand side of the window, this is just the standard WSJTX window, is all of the signals that are being decoded. And on the right-hand side of the window are the signals being decoded on the specific frequency that I'm listening on. And in this particular case, you see the purple. The purple is Victor Echo 4 Zulu India Mike, and the yellow are my transmissions. And in this particular case, I'm transmitting, and Victor Echo 4 Zulu India Mike is not hearing me. So this was pretty frustrating. So let's go down the path of how to figure this out. I'm framing this presentation with a hypothesis that this overall approach is equally applicable to other digital modes. So when I talk about digital modes, I'm referring to modes of radio communication that require digital processing. So typically you connect your computer. CW is not a digital mode with this definition, but things like WSJTX application and all of the related modes that it supports, FLDigi modes, including PSK, MFSK, FSQ. I did a presentation earlier this year on FSQ, and to some degree, my working with some of you to get FSQ operating on your computer was an inspiration for what I'm sharing with you today. WinLink is equally applicable, VAR-AC, and there are a host of other modes. So this is my hypothesis, and I'll seek your feedback towards the end to learn whether my suggestions are equally applicable for those other digital modes. Well, a general experience that I have is that many times stuff changes on the computer. All kinds of stuff changes. Many times it changes without our awareness. You know, a standard troubleshooting approach is to ask ourselves the question of what changed. And it seems like with Windows particularly, but any operating system, it's pretty hard to answer that question. Things can change, including application updates. The operating system default settings might get changed, in which case some of the settings get stolen by other applications. If you take your system down or move it, change the port settings, just a veritable host of changes. The framework that I have found pretty valuable that I'm going to share with you today is one that I learned about in my working life. I had a career job in corporate America. And we use something called the model for improvement. And the model for improvement is predicated fundamentally on the scientific method. The scientific method, you can see in the circle below, in the quadrant labeled plan, that's where we just make some mental notes about what we're trying to do before we actually implement the change or collect the data. And then after we implement the change or collect the data, then we're going to study what the results to learn whether we've learned something new. And then we're going to make decisions about what we do next. Have we solved the problem? Do we need to do more troubleshooting? So this little cycle happens frequently in a troubleshooting process. And what's helpful about this particular framing, this model for improvement, are the three questions at the top. What are we trying to accomplish? How will we know that a change is an improvement? And what changes can we make that will result in an improvement? So in my example, here are those improvement questions with my answers. What are we trying to accomplish? Well, in this case, I'm framing it that we've been able to operate before. Our goal is to restore our radio system operation in order to make digital contacts. So that's the objective. We're going to know that a change is an improvement if we're able, in fact, to make a contact, if we get a 73 back. And the last question really helped me reduce my stress level. And it's just to simply remember that we can change settings, and if worst comes to worst, we can swap out components in our troubleshooting process. So here's a high-level plan that I've identified. And it begins with drawing the system. I'll talk about that a little bit more. It's very helpful to make sure that each of the boxes in your system is working correctly before worrying about the interfaces, one box to another. Step number 3 is collecting data. Most all of our transceivers have visible indications of RF power out, for example, so we're going to take advantage of some of those visible indications on our transceivers. Then we're going to interrogate settings, being very careful to only test one change at a time before, in the worst case, swapping out components. So here is a generalized system picture that I created. At the center of the picture is our transceiver. Okay, so here's the transceiver. To the left is the power sources. Maybe we have a battery, 12-volt power supply that gets fed by house power. That's fed from the grid. Sometimes it can be very helpful in troubleshooting of other problems, not this particular one, but to remind ourselves of this overall power supply system. Our radio might be connected to an amplifier. We might have a tuner before the radio frequency signals get out to the antenna. As I think most of us know that have tried digital modes, if we have an older HF radio, or if we have a VHF, UHF radio that doesn't have a USB interface, then we're going to need some kind of a digital mode interface. There are lots available on the marketplace. This is a picture of a Signal Link, the DigiRig. There are many, many others. Because fundamentally, the digital mode interface communicates receive audio, audio received by the transceiver to the computer, transmit audio, audio generated by the computer, or push to talk from the computer. So that's the generalized view. Here's my particular system that we're going to be testing. I've generalized the power supply system. I don't have the amp or tuner. So fundamentally, we're just going to be focusing on this relationship, the relationship between the computer and the transceiver. I'm also using Windows 10. I've done the same process with Linux on Raspberry Pis, Mac OS. The particular application we're using is WSJTX, and we've got the benefits of a 7300 that's got a USB device. So the second step in the high-level plan is to make sure that each individual box is working. And in this case, we can make sure that the 7300 is working just by verifying that we can work on single sideband or a different different mode. In this particular case, the antenna has a low SWR, so that's not the problem related to our making a contact. I've verified that I'm on the most recent version, such as can be for Windows 10 and the digital application. In this particular case, it's not the most current version, but I know it's a working version. So here's that application picture again of WSJTX, and what observations can we make from this application? Well, one is Victor Echo 4 Zulu India Mike is not hearing me. Now it could be propagation, certainly, but we're going to go down a path to make sure that we're getting our signals out there. So decoding is happening. This is a piece of data in our overall process. We've got computer encoded call signs here. We're capturing data. Here's the waterfall that WSJTX provides. And if you look real close, you'll see that it's not as strong as it has been in the past. That's kind of interesting. So step number 3 is to collect data. And many times in the course of my going through my own problems, I forget that the transceiver itself has important information that we should look at. So let's look at the picture of the 7300. So here's the first data point. The transmit LED is on, but look over here. See PO? PO, this is interesting. Power output is 0. So this, in all likelihood, is a contributory factor for our not being able to make contacts. So why are we getting no power output? Well, there are 3 places in our radio system where settings are defined. And in one sense, we could almost start anywhere. There are settings associated with the radio, settings associated with the application, and settings associated with the operating system. But in this case, we're going to start with the application settings. If you will, it's at the tail end of the process. If there are setting problems earlier on, we'll likely detect them. So the application is WSJTX. Let's have a look at the settings for WSJTX. Select the file, select settings, and the next window that comes up is this one. And it may be hard for you to see on the screen, but this is kind of interesting because it indicates that the input and the output settings, while they should be connected to our transceiver, rather are pointing to the internal mic and internal speaker. Well, okay, so we found the first setting to change. We're going to consider this pair a single change. We're going to change them to the USB audio codec, and the next thing we're going to do is look at the transceiver to see what's happening during transmit. And look what's happening in this situation. The transmit LED is on. The power out, good grief, the power out is still 0. So this hasn't done the trick. Well, let's go back and look at the application one more time. The application, and this is true of WSJTX, and I somehow forget it. This idea is that I'm going to share with you is equally true for FLDigi, and it is that there is a power slider. Sometimes FLDigi calls it an attenuator in the application on the front screen that controls the power output. And if you can see that tiny blue little indicator on the lower right-hand corner, so this is a sign that we're not getting any power out. So it is set to minimum. Let's set it to maximum, and let's go back. Okay, you know, we're kind of going through this plan, do, study, act loop each time. Let's see if this change has affected improvement. And it has. Well, this is pretty cool. Wait a minute. This shows power output, so we are getting power output. That's good, but it's showing 30 watts. What's peculiar about this is I distinctly remembered setting the transceiver power output setting to 50 watts. So what's going on here? Well, now it's time to go look for more settings. We're going to look at the operating system settings. In the Windows lower left-hand corner, you can type the word sound and pop up a sound dialog box. And here, clearly an indication. The master volume for the speakers is very low. This probably is the explanation. I found that 80% works pretty well, so I'm going to put it up to 80%, and let's see what happens. And we've got some improvement. The transmit LED is on. The power output is 50 watts. It's looking like complete success. Let's go back to that application and try things out. So here's WSJTX application again. The orange is X-ray Echo 1 Echo Lima India, a Mexican station. I reply to him. The yellow is my transmitted signal. He doesn't hear me a couple of times, but then he comes back. Here, this red line is giving me feedback that he's heard me. He's giving me a signal report. This is looking pretty good. And there it is. There's the 73. Looks like we're in good shape. Our little troubleshooting process has been successful. But wait. There's one more operating system setting that we need to check. And it can be helpful because we might find some interesting information if we set it, if we check it. And that setting is to go through and look at the control panel for Windows. We'll type control, select hardware and sound, select sound, and it lists all of the sound devices. And here's the interesting discovery. And it is that the USB audio codec is the default device. Now this creates problems that could include, for example, and this has happened to me, in my working with another ham using Zoom to do some troubleshooting. Zoom defaults to the default audio device, so Zoom was talking to the transceiver. We need to change the default audio device to the speakers. We do that, we get corrected. Another inadvertent problem that can arise when the transceiver audio devices are the default is if you use the soft keys on your laptop for volume increasing or decreasing, and if your radio is the soft keys, this is one of the ways that the operating system volume for the transceiver can go down to 0. It's important to make sure it's not the default device. Well, so this overall process has worked. I find that the radio system diagram really helped a lot and helped me to reduce the apprehension and the concern that I had about going through this process overall. Now, some of you are super Elmers and you've got these mental pictures in your head, but for me, particularly when I was just getting started, having a physical picture really helped. Something else that helps is just to know that most digital problems are in fact settings. I guess I can say that from personal experience, but also from having helped a number of you trying to get started on FSQ, for example. Most problems are settings, not entirely, but most of the time. And here's that hypothesis again. Every digital application requires correct settings for the application, for the operating system, or for the transceiver. So in this way, I think that there's a lot of similarity between troubleshooting digital modes, whether it's WSJTX, FLDigi, or even WinLink. And for me, this idea of listing the steps, remembering to test one step at a time, really helps to take the agita out of digital mode troubleshooting. So here's a summary list. In this particular example that we've talked through, there are 4 problems that we've had to identify and resolve. And on this particular screen, they're listed in yellow. Other problems that I've encountered, the COM port getting set in correctly. That can happen when if you plug or unplug, plug it into a different port. A transceiver baud rate setting not matching the setting for the baud rate that's in the application. And I encountered an interesting problem in which for a 7610, which has 2 data ports, the data port was not getting set correctly by the application. Well, these are just the problems that I've encountered. I really enjoy digital modes a lot more now as a result of feeling a little bit more confident that I can go through the process. I've included some resources. That being said, I'd love to entertain any questions that you might have. Yes, Paul.
Question on your one screen where you showed the power slider for WSJTX. I was told by one of my Elmers that you don't want it cranked up as high as you had it to try to get maximum power out. You want to have it at a level where your ALC, because you don't need ALC, is really still at 0. So instead of maybe 50 watts, you're at 35 watts to get the ALC out, but it supposedly brings you a cleaner signal. Just a question.
Yes, okay, so Paul's asking the question about the output slider. One of the web-based resources suggested for the WSJTX output slider, the output slider should be around 70% or 80%. And yes, I've read that same idea, which is that the output slider should be set a little bit low maximum. Now, that being said, as we've seen here, there are at least a couple of different ways to affect the output power, the output volume. The output slider is one of them, and another one is through the operating system setting. So they're all kind of interacted. The 7300, I also heard no ALC. I've got another radio that requires ALC. So
depends on the rig. I have the 7610, and the recommendation was no ALC.
So Paul said he has the 7610, and the recommendation is no ALC. So, okay, thank you for that question about the power slider. Paul, another, go ahead.
The screen that you had of the 7300.
Yeah.
Can you go back to that? Yeah, right there. That right there.
Yeah.
You can tell the Zoom people because they can't see this. But where it says USB-D, I have a big, huge note that says data mode. I always forget to make it go into data mode.
Yep. Okay, so the comment from Paul is that a challenge that he has is making sure that his transceiver is in the right data mode. His particular transceiver needs to be in data mode rather than USB, for example. Okay?
Can you mention the 7610 issue of data 2 for WinLink? Just so we'll go down that.
Okay, so I mentioned the 7610. More specifically, the problem that Jeff, DCP, and I encountered in doing troubleshooting with his 7610 is that WinLink has a peculiar behavior. And that peculiar behavior is that WinLink always wants to use data 1, but if you have a 7610, the 7610 wants you to use data 2. So Jeff has found that he needs to manually reset the data mode for 7610s.
Supposedly there is the beta version.
And supposedly there's an upcoming change for the for WinLink to get WinLink to operate correctly. Okay, any other comments or questions?
Just a gotcha for those who run Ham Radio Deluxe. When I was playing with John with Vera AC, that you can't play Vera AC with Ham Radio Deluxe because the way that the transceiver interacts Ham Radio Deluxe wants to be king all the time and won't allow Vera AC to take over the computer to transmit. I had to set up a separate laptop, screen, everything, radio, and then it was happy. But it
So-
won't play with Ham Radio Deluxe.
Paul WD9 IOK has had personal experience in trying to get VAR AC, that's the chat mode based on FT8, to get that chat mode to work with Ham Radio Deluxe, and it just won't do it. Jeff, DCP.
So after you solved the given problem, you went a step further into the control panel to identify a potential future problem. The default setting changed. What triggered you to do that? Was it because you had a problem with that in the past, or was there some evidence or data in the preceding steps that caused you to take that step?
Jeff DCP is asking me the question about why in this slide presentation and this troubleshooting I chose, after everything appeared to be working fine, we made a successful contact, I chose to still go back and check the settings through the control panel. And why did I do that? And I did that for two reasons. One of the reasons is I've been down that path before, and I know that that problem has arisen. Now, a logical reason for doing it, even if you hadn't had that experience, is asking the question, what might have changed that caused me to have the problem in the beginning? And if you go down the path of asking that question, then you'll want to look at all settings all the time just to assure yourself that, the stars are aligned and you won't have another problem in the future.
Any Zoom questions?
Are there any Zoom questions? We're not well equipped to do that in this. We kind of need somebody to look at the chat. We don't have a way to pipe Zoom audio into this room. Ted has a question.
Yeah, you mentioned FL digit for MIDI, I guess.
Yes.
Do you have anything to say about MMTTY?
MMTTY is the question. My hypothesis is that the same principles apply, that there are settings for the application, for the operating system, and in the transceiver. And in order to be successful, you need to look in those three places. I haven't used MMTTY, so I don't have personal experience in troubleshooting it. Okay?
There's no other questions. Thank you, Hoop.